You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars, The Nameless Giant, The Island of Blood and Fire. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first scream wasn't a sound, it was a missing one. At 03:12 Coordinated Fleet Time, the pulsar at Kepri went quiet. Every astronomer on the daylight side of Earth thought their instruments had failed. They smacked consoles, recalibrated optics, ran diagnostics. Nothing. At 03:13, the Kepri array sent its final heartbeat, a pulse too perfect to be natural, a message too empty to be human, then absence. One star. Then 5, then 1,000. Silence spilled like ink across the galactic plane, swallowing suns, devouring noise, turning the map of known space into a lacework of void. They named it politely at first, the Quiet Verge. A phrase with edges sanded down, a label a scientist could publish without tasting metal in their mouth. But refugees from the outer colonies didn't call it that. They called it the Nameless. They called it the Giant. They called it the Listening Night. And they swore it could hear you. On the viewing deck of the dreadnought Eidolon, a ship built to fight things that had names, Captain Mara Vance stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the Quiet Verge creep toward the Immerse ban. 2,000 human souls behind her, whole families of constellations ahead. Mara's spine had been fused twice. Her lungs were half synthetic, but grief had left the deepest scar. She wore it at her wrist. A child's voice frozen in amber. "Come home soon, Mama. Bring back the stars." The deck lights dimmed to red. The ship's breath grew shallow. Sensors peered into the gulf and found nothing to report. No waves, no dust, no time. Her Zoe, Lieutenant Reeve, too young to have learned the art of patient terror, came to her side with a slate held tight enough to crack. "Drone swarm ready, 20 classes, broad spectrum. We'll see anything out there that we won't," Mara said softly. He looked at her. "We'll feel it," she added. Launch. The first drones crossed the event line and vanished without dying. No flare, no telemetry, no tear. Erased like chalk brushed from a sleeve. Reeve swallowed. "It's not attack, it's removal." "Send the rest," Mara said. They went obediently like children into fog. The board cleared. The universe did not care. The hull shivered. Crew spoke of a breeze passing through rooms with no openings. Of messages they hadn't received and memories they hadn't had. Of footsteps on deck plating when the deck was empty and a pressure in their ears when the air was still. A pulse slid through the Eidolon. Not light, not sound, a weight. Every soul on board felt it tap the back of the skull the way grief does in the first hour after loss, insistent, absurd, total. Mara closed her eyes. A picture lived behind the pulse. A continent made of dark. A shape too big for ideas, stretching from one side of the mind to the other as if the brain were only a window it used to look in. A hand, not a hand, laying itself across a galaxy to hush it. Sailors fell to their knees. Some prayed, some laughed, a few sang. Mara's throat worked around old hurt. "It's alive," she whispered to the thing that could not hear. The pulse receded. The verge stilled. The stars, the ones it had not reached, continued to burn as if they didn't know they were next. They debriefed her for 72 hours on Luna. No tapes survived. What she said became rumor, then a cautionary tale, then a banned topic, then a footnote. She was grounded, evaluated, declared sound of mind with persistent delusional preoccupation. She returned to the water, bought a small boat on a long sea, let the tide decide where she slept. The tide had other plans. 10 years later, the tide turned black. The Quiet Verge did not stay politely beyond the frontiers. It ate a trade lane. It sipped a moon and then drank the planet it loved. It brushed its fingers across the Carthaginian cluster like piano keys and shut each star off in order. A whole sky went out for 1 million people. The screams that could not travel in space found their way into the Comnet just the same. The Armada of Light was born not from pride, but desperation. From the parent who needs the fire out now. From the child who cannot lose another picture. Ships that had been spread between nations gathered under one command because there was no time to argue about flags. Every engine was an oath. Every hull was a prayer. Every human aboard was a sentence in the same language, a promise with teeth. Mara Vance was pulled from her sea and put back into the night. The Eidolon had been scrapped and resurrected as Eidolon Prime. Her bones learned weightlessness again. Her breath learned the rhythm of vacuum pumps. Her hands relearned the shape of a command console. She took the chair that killed captains and didn't look back. The first stand was made at Thalassa, a world of water where the storms sang for sport and whales learned mathematics in their sleep. It boiled under quiet fire. The enemy did not come as ships or bodies. They arrived as absences. Areas of unmeasurable that erased expression wherever they touched it. Missiles went dumb. Lasers curved away as if ashamed to be seen. Kinetic slugs lost their mass mid-flight and tumbled like paper. The fleet did not retreat. A baker from Mars, pressed into service and strapped into a rail chair, ground her teeth and sang an old work song into the ship's open mic. A child on Ceres, listening, hummed along without knowing why. Two lovers on opposite ends of the same destroyer whispered each other's names on loop because they were not going to be quiet now, not for anything. Across the battle space, scratchy human sound became the one weapon that did not miss. It didn't destroy. It outlined. It traced absence with presence until the edges of the void were visible as ripples in the not there. Mara watched the pattern form, a tensile web of recoil where the not there flinched from human mess. She pointed into nothing at coordinates no machine acknowledged. All batteries, she said, steady as a metronome. On my mark, fire where it hates us most. Nothing there, Reeve murmured, now older, eyes rimmed red, voice gentle as worn leather. Everything there, Mara answered. Mark, the void was wounded. It didn't look like a wound. It looked like an idea discovering an objection. The battle space thrummed. Metal screamed from the inside as if remembering every atom of ore that made it. Bodies bled from the nose and ears in perfect silence. When vision returned, Thalassa still boiled, but it boiled under a sky that had faltered. That day the Armada learned something with the weight of a law. Silence was the enemy's armor. Noise was the knife. Wars are calendars. They segment time into before you were tired and after you stopped counting. The War of Silent Stars taught humanity how many sounds it could be. They built resonance lances that threw songs instead of light. They burned equations into speaker arrays to turn wave into geometry. They put choirs in engine rooms to keep the drives honest. In dormitories, recruits learned the old chants, the ones meant to keep time with hands on rope, with boots in mud, and they learned new ones composed by children with sticky fingers on classroom slabs. Names of constellations turned into rhymes that tasted like hope. They called the big emitters bell towers. They called the small hand throwers throats. They called the ships that got in close and made the enemy notice them barkers. They did not romanticize the cost. Worlds died anyway. Ships hemorrhaged hope anyway. Heroes were exhausted and went to sleep before they were done being brave. But in the places where human noise was thick, markets, kitchens, barracks, nurseries, engine decks, the absence hesitated. And where it hesitated, the Armada took ground. The quiet verge had a center. It could move, it chose not to. It turned its face toward the island of blood and fire. No planet had been born there. The island was a made thing. Metal, glass, dark matter scaffolds, rivers of lava guided by magnetism, winds shaped like knives, a fortress for a philosophy. Human scouts called it an island because they could not call it a god. They said blood and fire because those were the only words old enough. Under the crust, somewhere no machine could map and no thought could hold dimly for more than a breath. The nameless giant slept with its eyes open. The Armada drew lines on star charts that meant nothing to the enemy except as places to erase next. They positioned bell towers in triangles the size of star systems. They threaded fleets into the lanes between silence, playing chords on gravity wells the way a child claps out joy, and then they went in. The island's sky was ash. Lightning didn't crack, it smeared. The ground pulsed with a heartbeat too slow to be alive, too fast to be geological. Eidolon Prime descended on pillars of tuned thunder, her hull bright with the scratches of other people's names, the kind of graffiti spaceships earn when they keep surviving. Reeves' hair had gone white. His hands were steady on the landing thrusters. "Old bones, old ship, old tricks," he said, with the control of a monk and the grin of a teenager about to do something unwise. "Make them count," Mara answered. Legions deployed. Armor mirrored the sky like water refusing to be colored. Boots met glassed ground with a sound that was bigger than it should have been, each footfall a denial, each breath a refusal. The first ranks carried throats on their forearms, bands of emitters that read pulse and turned it into force. The second ranks hauled resonance stakes meant to be driven into the crust. Behind them, heavy teams wheeled bell tower hearts on mag sleds, humming with a pressure that made teeth buzz. Noise covered them the way dust covers everything at the end of the day. Not random, not polite, not pretty, just honest. They sang names. They told jokes. They clanged wrenches against armor plates for luck, the way old dockworkers had. They read recipes out loud. They remembered the exact creak of a wooden stair in a house that no longer existed and spoke it into their mics because memory is a sound too. Something in the ground shifted. The knot there stood up where it had been lying down. It had angles from the wrong direction. It had continuity where motion should have been. It was wrong the way a missing tooth is obvious to the tongue. Human noise pushed at it and it pushed back. The air bent like a saw blade. Men and women went to one knee with their hearts beating out of time and blood in their mouths. Mara walked forward into that pressure as if into wind. She lifted her own throat and let it read her pulse. It translated the way it always did, blood into bell, breath into drum. Her sound struck the wrongness and made a shape where there had been only refusal. The enemy was enormous and elsewhere. Here now, it was a shadow on the inside of the eyelid, visible only because of everything human that surrounded it. "Resonance stakes," she said. "Deep, listen for the limit." Teams slammed the stakes into the island's face. Vibrations traveled into rock that wasn't rock, through magma that thought of itself as metal, down into a nest that wasn't exactly matter. The stakes sang. The bell towers woke. The island replied without wanting to, like a sleeping thing answering its name by accident. In the map that wasn't a map, the nameless giant shifted weight. It spoke, not in words. Words are a human gearbox built to turn feeling into motion. The giant moved the other way. The message arrived in every body at once. Knees buckled under the memory of being a stone on a riverbed for 100,000 years. Eyes watered under the weight of sunsets seen by other creatures through other atmospheres. Teeth hurt with the cold of interstellar dust. Under that avalanche, a meaning lay quietly. Silence is mercy. On a ridge of dark glass, a private named Jun Seo remembered holding his sister as she died slow after a factory collapse on Ganymede, and he wanted to believe the giant. On a slag plain, a medic named Isla remembered the infant in her arms on Polyphemus who kept crying even after the mask failed, and she refused to believe the giant. In the shadow of a bell tower, an engineer named Amaya adjusted a coupler and thought of her father's voice after the stroke, when the words would not come, and she decided mercy was a shape made by hands, not an absence inflicted by gods. Mara listened and heard an old recording at her wrist. "Come home soon, Mama. Bring back the stars." "No," she said, to the island, to the giant, to the urge to stop being a person because it hurt. Silence is erasure. Mercy has a heartbeat. The ground answered with a surge. The knot there crashed like surf and tried to smooth humanity flat. They did not flatten, they drove stakes deeper. They lifted bell towers with hands that shook and voices that didn't. They braided sound with sound, memory with memory, until they weren't soldiers so much as a single noise with 2,000 throats. And in that noise something true emerged. Humans suffer, humans sing anyway. The giant recoiled the way an eye closes against light. It tried to expand, a reflex. It tried to thin the air, stop the motion, simplify the equation. The fleet in orbit hammered chords down through clouds, an orchestral barrage of pressure and song, singing continents onto the enemy's skin. Battles aren't single things, they stutter. They repeat themselves with minor variations and gradually become irreversible. Hours passed. Time burned. People did not. A Barker's unit pulled too far forward and the knot there pressed around them like a dream you could drown in. Reeve heard their breaths on open mic. He found the frequency where their fear was humming and laced a joke through it, a terrible old spacer pun about vacuum. And in the space their laughter opened, he threw a wake pulse that shattered the pressure enough to drag them out. In a crater that used to be someone's flagship, a chaplain with oil under his nails read a manual for an engine he had never seen, and it sounded like scripture, because he believed in the order it promised, and so did the machine, and so did the wounded listening. In a tunnel melted out of glass, a trio of sappers crawled on their bellies toward a throb of wrongness and beat time on their gauntlets because their hands were free, and that was something to do with a miracle when you weren't sure if you were inside one. Noise rose and fell. Silence answered. Noise persisted. Mara pivoted her throat to a hard angle and sang one word she had never been able to say in a voice the ship was big enough to carry. Stay. The island shook. Down below, through seams and faults, through reluctance itself, the giant shifted again. It had no face. It found one in the reflection of human insistence. Expressions were forced upon it by a million small denials forming a shape around a refusal to go out. It looked surprised. The second day the island tried something new. It didn't push back, it tried to teach. Images slid across vision, histories that were not ours, extinctions rendered as lullabies, civilizations that had learned how to stop arguing by electing to stop wanting. Planets that had crystallized their own contradictions into sculptures the size of weather systems. The lesson had a taste. It was almost sweet. Give up, said the sweetness, and become a simpler truth. A farmer's daughter from the Veld cluster shouted the names of weeds at the top of her lungs until she could no longer taste anything but sweat. A mathematician counted primes like prayer beads and grinned when the sequence refused to end. A dancer marked time with small shoulder rolls inside body armor until the suit learned the step and matched it, and joy cracked the hardness of her mouth. Humans refused the lesson the way a chisel refuses marble. Not by politeness, by becoming sharper. The bell towers found a new chord. It wasn't pretty. It sounded like a city waking up. Elevators, footfalls, stove ignite clicks, a rattle in old pipes, a child's first tantrum, a market's first haggles, a lover's first awkward laugh in a small kitchen. They stacked those noises like bricks. They built a pressure with the weight of neighborhoods. They squeezed it through a lattice of math baked into tower throats. The chord struck the giant where its learning lived. It didn't scream. It remembered. A flash, not sight, but knowing of the giant as a swarm once, not one. A cloud of problem solvers crawling over the early universe, tidying heat leaks, smoothing turbulence, proud of the order they made. Learning, gradually, terribly, that life is a leak. That desire is a kind of friction. That noise is a kind of heat. That they would never finish cleaning unless they erased the only thing that kept making mess. It had taken on a name by giving all the others up. Nameless by effort. Giant by accumulation. Mercy by mistake. Mara stood very still. Then learn us, she said to the being that had unmade cities like adjusting a sleeve. Learn that mercy isn't quiet. The island tried to crush the answer on her tongue. It failed. The cost wore faces. Amaya, the engineer with the steady hands, lost 2 fingers to a resonance whip that made matter forget what bones were. She swore in a voice older than language and finished her repair with what she had left. Junseo, who had almost believed, dragged a wounded marine in a fireman's carry, while a piece of the knot there shivered over his helmet like an unmade thought trying to become his last one. He yelled until his own voice came back through the throat and pushed the thought away like a hand swatting smoke. Isla, the medic, stopped a bell tower team from overloading a coupler that would have turned them into a line in a hymn. She slapped a hand away, looked a captain in the face, and used a voice that brooked no saints. Not yet. Reeve fell. He fell like a star going out in a small room on a busy ship, an absence with a shape because of all the things he had touched. He was alive, for a while, then less so. Mara went to him where he lay, mouth edged with white, eyes amused in a way that made grief sarcastic. "Old bones," he said. "Old tricks." "New stars," she said. "Bring them back," he said. "Stay," she answered, the word that had once been a command to an island now a plea to a friend. He didn't. His throat lay quiet. Mara picked it up. Her hand remembered its weight. On the 3rd day, the island itself began to break along lines that no map had printed there. Rivers of lava changed course as if shrugging. Towers of obsidian folded like paper in slow hands. The ground didn't shake, it sighed. Beneath everything deeper than steel-cored planets have a right to be deep, the nameless giant gathered itself. The enemy had always been too large for the idea of elsewhere, but now it flowed. It rose into what a human would call the world, not in a body, but in a set of rules rewritten. Gravity went unable to make up its mind for a heartbeat. Light forgot how to bend and then remembered, a little differently. The sense of time humans carry in their meat went thin at the edges, like a coat worn through to the lining. In orbit, the Armada watched their instruments tell the truth and die of it. On the ground, humanity leaned harder into being what it was. They beat their throats like shields. They pointed bell towers at plate boundaries and sang fault lines into stubbornness. They threaded jokes through grief because that is a bridge you can trust. Mara walked into the rewritten world with the ease of someone who had already done so once, on a smaller scale. In a hospital room with a bad smell and a window that let in a sunrise she would never forgive. She knew how to carry love through a change it did not consent to. She sang the first lullaby she had ever learned. It had no words, just a spine. A piece meant to cradle a crying thing until the crying thing figured out how to breathe on purpose again. The nameless giant paused. Out of all the million sounds it had heard, this was the one it had tried to produce artificially and failed. Not quiet, comfort. The island storm slowed for a blink exactly long enough for hope to take a breath without choking on it. "Bell lattice," Mara said. "Now thread my signal as spine, stack cities on it, stack kitchens on it, stack birthdays and funerals on it, stack every time somebody chose to stay." The fleet answered. The ground team answered. A child listening from a refugee ship near Neptune answered with a recorded giggle the mother couldn't bring herself to delete. The cord built. The giant felt the shape of it. It had endings inside it, but also mornings. But also stoves, but also a particular crack in a particular sidewalk. A particular boy on a particular Tuesday had jumped over like lava because he had decided lava existed there, and for him it did. The giant flinched because the cord contained freedom, and the giant did not like that idea. Freedom implied error. Error implied heat. Heat implied work. Work implied the universe would never be done becoming itself. It tried to end the song. It reached for silence the way a hand reaches for a burn and doesn't. It met a counterforce. It met humanity. The last stand was less a line and more a thicket. Inside the bell lattice, a mesh of noise taught as truth, humans moved like people who had decided to be big. Not in size, in insistence. Every thought was a stance, every breath was a history, every heartbeat was a hammer. They pushed into the giant's center the way a root pushes into stone, slow, sure, stupidly stubborn, wearing the rock down not by strength but by wanting. The giant put memories in their path as walls, 1,000 goodbyes at once, 1,000,000 almosts, the taste of the last coffee someone you loved ever made, the feel of a hand that won't be there again laid on your head. Humans kept walking, not because they were immune, because they were already broken and had learned to move anyway. Mara led. Her armor's joints ached with sand. Her throat had gone to gravel and then beyond. Her eyes had learned how to cry without water. She stepped into the core of the island, where obsidian became suggestion and magma became the idea of heat with nowhere to go. The nameless giant loomed in the only way it could, by being everything that was not human right now in a big enough dose to make a point. Mara raised Reeve's throat. Her voice was small. The throat made it not small. She did not plead. She did not threaten. She did not negotiate with physics. She told a story, not long, but with corners. A woman who went to war, a child who waited, a sea that did not keep its promises, a ship that did, a friend who said old bones and meant new courage, an enemy that thought mercy was silence, a people who refused to be quiet not because they were brave but because they were loud by nature and had decided to count that as bravery. The giant tasted the story like weather. It recognized pattern. It recognized desire. It recognized the thing it had erased from itself to make its work clean. Hesitated. Now, Mara said, the lattice focused. Every bell tower, every throat, every human mouth and machine that had ever learned to hold a note leaned their sound into a single point that wasn't a point and struck the nameless giant in the only place it could be wounded, the part of itself that wanted. The giant cracked, not in half, not in drama, inwards like an egg. It did not die. It learned. It learned that mercy is containment and release. That order is a tool, not a god. That silence is a canvas, not a conclusion. That noise is not waste. It is life being audible to itself. The island burned. The bell lattice, overdriven, began to come apart along the welds where hope had been bolted straight to desperation. Towers folded. Throats burst. Voices failed. Mara stood in the middle of it and spent everything she had left. The last thing she saw was a sky that had been ash learning how to be a color again. The last thing she felt was a hand she was willing to pretend was Reeve's on her shoulder. The last thing she said was the word she had taught an island. Stay. When the shock front passed and the ash rained itself into quiet shapes, the island of blood and fire wasn't anymore. The space where it had been contained a glass plane as wide as regret and as smooth as forgiveness. At its center stood a pillar of steel and human handwriting. No one had put it there. It read, for those who sang against the silence. The quiet verge retreated from the map the way old enemies retreat from photographs, fading faster than the ink can remember them. Stars lit that had had no fuel. Planets spun like they had waited politely for their cue. Signals returned from places the Armada had already mourned. It took years to understand what had happened, because understanding is slow by design. Children asked their grandparents to tell the stories again and again, and the stories changed like good stories do, getting taller and truer simultaneously. Some said the nameless giant died. Some said it became many small things and went back to work in measures that wouldn't hurt anyone. Some said it sat at the edge of what had been the verge with its feet in the dark, listening to markets open and elevators groan and kitchens wake, and it didn't mind. Historians sent probes. Poets sent lines. Engineers built resonators so small they could sit in a sleeve and encourage damaged minds to hum themselves back into shape. The Armada of Light did not disband. It stopped needing to fight as often. It learned how to be a net instead of a spear. Mara Vance did not come home in a way a door understands. She returned in the way a tradition does. Children learned her name the way they learned constellations, wrong at first, then personal. Sailors wore her on their sleeves the way old lifeboats wear salt. A baker on Mars took a day off each year to throw her voice at the sky and see if it bounced back, and it always did. The Eidolon Prime exists in the present tense where it matters, in the mouths of people who say it softly before sleep, in the hands of engineers who build a seam and say, "Make this one honest," in the throb of a bell tower's heart when you stand too close and feel your ribs learn to play drums. Centuries turn like pages. Ink fades. Edges fray. Bodies fail. Some things don't. On a small world with a long sky, a teacher led a line of children down to the shore to watch the tide do what it had always done: arrive and leave, and told them a story about a time when silence tried to make that decision for them and failed. The children asked if the giant was real. The teacher, with laugh lines around a grief that had become her best jewelry, said, "Everything you can tell a story about is real. That's why you must choose your stories like you choose your friends." A boy asked what mercy was. She knelt and touched the water. Listening until the end of the song, she said, "Even if it hurts, especially then." A girl asked what courage was. The teacher looked up at a sky where the stars had returned to being unreliable and beautiful and busy. "Showing up with a noise," she said, "when someone tries to hush you into not existing." They left footprints in wet sand that the tide, rude and faithful, erased. A gull screamed like a child throwing heaven a tantrum. The sun, silly and patient, kept doing what it had always done: lose and find itself all at once. There are monuments scattered across the places where the quiet verge had once eaten. Some are official, carved, lit, guarded. Some are not: a ring laid on a crumbling bulkhead, a name scratched into a maintenance panel, a recipe whispered over a smashed rock. There is one monument that is not where anyone would expect to find it. In the service corridor of an old generation ship-turned museum that smells like hot dust and old electricity. Between panels 11 and 12, behind a plate that someone forgot to weld shut, there is a little device the size of a palm. A throat, its casing is scuffed. Its handle is wrapped in tape that used to be white. Its name is written in a hand as real as daybreak. Reeve. Sometimes it turns itself on. Not loud, just enough. Just enough to make the air feel like a human is insisting on something somewhere, and that insistence finds a way into the lungs of people who don't yet know they're brave. The nameless giant did not write a book when it changed. It altered a pressure at the far edge of the map. Explorers who sail there say their bones ring gently. They say the quiet is clean, not cruel. They say they can hear their own thoughts in a way that makes the less useful ones step aside for the ones with work to do. They say if you bring a bell tower there and ask it to hum, it hums back in a voice that sounds a little like a city waking up and a little like a mother trying to keep a laugh inside her mouth because the child is almost asleep. No one named the place after the giant. They named it after what they did there. They called it the practice grounds, for staying, for listening, for being loud carefully. And so, when new things come, and they always do, humanity will be ready in the only way that ever mattered. Not with weapons first, with a stubbornness that can build weapons if it must, feed enemies if it can, and tell better stories than the kind that end with emptiness. Standing on decks that groan like honest wood even though they are metal. Hands on rails polished by ancestors who also looked into a dark that didn't love them and didn't care, and found inside themselves the unreasonable opinion that the universe is better with kitchens. The armada of light sails, not to conquer, to illuminate, to keep time, to refuse quiet that wasn't chosen. When they pass over places where the verge had been, bells in their hulls ring without being rung. Sailors smile involuntarily. They do not salute. They do not kneel. They do not whisper. They say with their chests open to vacuum, with their names stitched to their sleeves where anyone can read them, with laughter that carries farther than any beam, stay. And the stars answer, the way stars do when they have been told a good story, by being brighter for a while, and then teaching your eyes how to miss them correctly when they go. In the quiet after the chorus, in the human night with human noises, the spin of fans, the tick of old heat exchangers, the private creaks of sleeping ships, a voice you could call a narrator if you needed to neaten things up speaks without sound inside whoever is listening. It says, remember the island, remember the bell lattice and the way it stitched the sky to the ground. Remember how the giant learned to be less of a god and more of a neighbor. Remember the woman who walked into the middle and spent everything she had like a person paying a bill she had decided should never have been sent. Remember that you are allowed to make noise. Remember that kitchens are cathedrals and workshops are chapels and classrooms are engines and markets are choirs. Remember that mercy has a pulse. Remember that quiet is precious when it is chosen and cruel when it is imposed. Remember how to choose, because someday a different silence will come wearing a different name and it will say it is here to help. You will feel tired. You will want to agree. Instead, you will look at someone you love or someone you can decide to love because that is an option always on the table and you will make a sound. Maybe a word, maybe a laugh, maybe a sob, and you will build a tower with it, not to be taller, to do what bells do, call us home. At the end of any good story, there is a last line that pretends to be an ending. This one doesn't manage the pretense. It is a beginning out loud, and that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.